Okay, so tonight we're going to be beginning the civil rights movement. This presentation is going to serve as an introduction, and we're going to go over the major events that occurred that really led up to the explosion of the civil rights movement. The timeline of this PowerPoint will be about the end of World War II, so the latter half of the 1940s up until about the mid 1950s, right before, like I said, the civil rights movement really takes off. So by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to define what civil rights are. You'll know about legislation that helped but also hurt civil rights for African American people. And lastly, you will understand and know about what motivated people to get involved in the civil rights movement, what really prompted people to make this major push for civil rights for African American people in America. So first, we're just going to go over what civil rights are, what the definition is, and civil rights are the rights of citizens to political and social freedom and equality. As you can see with this little meme of Oprah Winfrey talking about how everybody in the audience gets a vote, you get a vote, you get a vote. It's a similar idea with civil rights in a society. It's applicable with voting. Everybody, whether you're a male, a female, whether you're black, you're white, or anything in between, you should have the right to vote. You should also have the right to equal educational opportunities. That's a major push that we'll see later in the civil rights movement, along with other stuff like bathrooms, water fountains, eating areas, desegregation in buses. Same thing, equal opportunity for everybody regardless of race. So we're going to go over some civil rights amendments that were passed before the civil rights movement in the 1950s. So first, after the Civil War ends, you have the passing of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. Then you have the 14th Amendment, which says that anybody who was born in the United States is considered to be a citizen regardless of race. And then the 15th Amendment is all men, regardless of their race, could vote. Sorry, it should say vote at the end there, the end of this slide right here. But also notice with the 15th Amendment, this only included men. Women were not able to vote yet. You won't see that until the 1920s. And something that needs to be noted when we discuss these amendments is that there's a lot of loopholes in them, a lot of ways that southern states were able to get around them, and we'll talk about that in a second. And a lot of states that engaged in this kind of loophole behavior were what we call Jim Crow states. They were all these southern states here in red are considered Jim Crow states. They are states that follow Jim Crow laws, which Jim Crow laws are essentially just laws that enforce segregation in certain spaces based on the race of different people. So you see that a lot in education. See it, like I said before, with buses, public transportation, dining, and among other things. So going back to the amendment issues, these Jim Crow states used literacy tests and poll taxes to prevent people from voting. So literacy tests were literal tests that people had to take in order to be able to vote. But oftentimes, only black people had to take these tests, and they were very difficult tests that oftentimes people couldn't pass. But for a lot of white people, they didn't have to take them, or they had enough educational opportunities to be able to pass these tests, whereas African American people did not have the same opportunities with education, so they weren't as literate and therefore would fail these tests. Next, you have poll taxes, which are relatively self-explanatory. If you wanted to vote, you needed to pay for it. And during this time, there was major wealth inequalities between black individuals and white people. So many black people could not afford to pay these poll taxes, and therefore they could not vote. And that was a big way that, even though there was amendments passed saying that people could vote regardless of race, all men had the opportunity to vote. This is a way that governments would prevent black people from voting and essentially continue to oppress them. So we're going to talk about the Double V campaign. This came out of World War II, this idea of what you see here in the image is a double victory, this idea of a double victory, a victory at home and a victory abroad. We discussed the victory abroad. We're referring to the literal victory of World War II. Then this victory at home refers to civil rights. So during World War II, there were plenty of black soldiers in the United States Army who were supposed to be fighting for freedoms that the American military is supposed to protect and afford people in America. And you saw this in World War I, and you see it again in World War II, where a lot of these black soldiers begin to kind of think like, hey, this isn't fair. We are literally sacrificing our lives just to go back home after this war ends, to be mistreated and not be as free as those who are of a white skin color. And there's this little quote here you can see on the top left side of the screen, and it's from James G. Thompson. He was a World War II soldier, and he was black. And he says, "Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Is the kind of America I know worth defending?" And this was an attitude that many black soldiers had coming out of World War II, and this is what really led people to want to fight for civil rights, because a lot of these soldiers were drafted into the military, so they couldn't dodge the war, they couldn't avoid fighting in this war, so they figured when they came back after fighting this war where they were literally putting their lives on the line, that's kind of what really was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. That's what really pushed them to want equality. We'll see when we really get into the mid-1950s and 60s and really get into the civil rights movement. Major push is seen for desegregation. You see it you see it here first in 1948. President Truman puts out the executive order to end segregation in the military. And following this, you'll see Brown versus Board of Education in the mid-1950s, which ends segregation in schools. You will see Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, which will seek to end segregation in public transportation, among other things. This is a major push. This is what really starts the civil rights movement. This is a major foundation for it, is the push to desegregate major areas of life that people have to deal with every single day. And that's it. That's the introduction to the civil rights movement.